Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very, very happy and pleased to bring the conversation I had with the lovely, the brilliant, the wonderful Cat Bohannon. Cat recently got her PhD at Columbia University, where she studied the evolution of narrative and cognition. Much of her writing has appeared in Scientific American, Science Magazine, Georgia Review, and others. And she is the author of the latest book, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. And it is fantastic. A great, great book. One of my favorites this year. Absolutely loved it. And I was just so pleased that I got to talk with her about it. We start the conversation by talking about first her wide and diverse academic background and really how this helped her prepare to write the book, which I thought was deeply fascinating. We talk about how she starts the book, about how there was many limited female subjects and many research papers in many disciplines, and how that is still true to this day, which is quite disturbing in some ways. And so how this is important to see how do we understand the role in which many women and females play within history, within science of history of science, and how do we see how we talk about women in science. We start all the way 200 million years ago with morgie, and we talk about here with this animal how milk became important for mammals. We talk about many features of milk, such as bonding, attachment, the letdown reflex. We obviously, if we're talking about milk, we're talking for females, we're talking about breasts, and we also talk about some of the sexual selection ideas from evolutionary psychology on breasts. We then move on to wombs. We talk about uteruses as well. We talk about wombs in terms from how it looks for monotremes, for marsupials, for placentals like us. We talk about the placenta. We talk about the menstrual cycle. We talk about the risks and difficulties of pregnancy. We talk about the grandmother hypothesis and some of her ideas on it, which were deeply fascinating. And we talk about the future of females in the 21st century. Now, as I say in the conversation, there's a lot in this book that we did not cover. Time is always my enemy in these situations, and even though I got to talk with Kat for a good bit, she talks about, as we mentioned in the conversation, but perception in females. She talks about brains and intelligence in females. She talks about some of the other physical aspects of the body. So we really we talk about many things here, such as in terms of the womb and the uterus and pregnancy and all these other features. But there are many other aspects in the book we didn't get to, which means everyone should go out there and pick up her book. I promise you, it's extremely well written, very clear, but very informative and detailed. And she has such a nice voice that comes through in the book, as I mentioned. And so it's absolutely wonderful. There was a slight, just as a kind of a bit of housekeeping on this bit of it, that one of this mishaps were one of my settings on the microphone was not completely turned on. So you may hear a little bit of a not as crystal clear as I'm coming in now on the mic. So apologies for that, but hopefully it doesn't take away from the content of a very good conversation. As always, you can find this conversation, all the conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. So get over there. If you haven't already subscribe, follow, like. You can contribute as well. I'm also on YouTube. Tell your friends, people, if you would like the podcast. Make sure you share it widely. And now I bring you Cat Bohannon. I'm here with Cat Bohannon. Cat, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Hey, sure. Happy to hang out.
Yeah. You've written a wonderful book, which is called
Thank
Eve,
you.
How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. And this is quite spectacular. I still can't believe this is your first book, which is, as we were saying before we got on, it's quite remarkable, and I know you've been working on it for a while. So we're going to get all into it. And before we do, Why don't you tell listeners who you are, what your background is academically and professionally, and what you're currently up to?
Right. So I'm Kat. I am a researcher and theorist in narrative cognition. So I just finished my PhD at Columbia University last year. Astonishingly, did indeed finish, yes. And my committee was split between literature and psychology with mentors over in neuro and comp sci. I wrote a bunch of computer programs essentially to understand how story works as a mnemonic. Why do stories help you remember stuff? That's what I did there. Just finished the PhD. Haven't started a postdoc yet because it seems I'm a bit busy on tour because I just wrote this rather large book.
Hmm?
But don't worry, the last third or so is notes, so you don't need to be intimidated.
Yeah, no, the book is absolutely fabulous. Yeah, it is the fastest. I mean, I think it clocks in over 600. I think it's about
Mm.
four some change, but it's really really great, and I like how you kind of organize it by talking about different kind of mammals, and you talk about different aspects of it. I guess the one question, we don't have to spend too much time on this, but I think it is interesting. Your background into this, as you were describing it, is I would not have put your background with a book on evolution and evolution of different types of mammals, things like that. So it's very much on females, but you cover the whole spectrum of things. And so I guess just briefly, how did your background in literature, and of course you've got your hands in a lot of different pots, how did that kind of prepare you to kind of write this book for, preparing for it for many years and to finally get it out
Well, given that my dad was a research psychologist and my mother was a pianist, well, there was never any hope for me to be normal, for sure. But it's also true that I grew up helping prep slides for dad's experiments by the time I was in puberty. I was a subject way before I was a researcher, so I've had lots of therapy.
there?
And like I have a kind of, it's not a sensory synesthesia. It's not that when I hear music I see color or anything like
Hmm.
that, but I do have a kind of intellectual synesthesia.
Hmm.
It's often the case that when I'm prepping my experiments, when I'm using more of my science mind to do some cog psych stuff, I often have a brain over in aesthetics and philosophy of aesthetics.
Hmm.
And vice versa, when I'm making art, I'm often making art about science. So, way before I did this book, I was a poet and
Hmm.
I was mostly writing poetry about science. Um, so what prepared me to write this book? Well, I think because I was always so very interdisciplinary, and my dissertation was very interdisciplinary too, with that committee split between the sciences and the humanities, and having to sort of please both.
Hmm.
Um, I was used to, how do I put it? To do interdisciplinary work, you have to have chutzpah, sure. Okay, you have to have enough ego to think you could remotely do it, there's that.
Sure.
But you also have to have a certain kind of willingness to be embarrassed,
Hmm.
actually. Because when you walk out of your training and you walk over, sometimes literally across the hall into another department, and sit down in someone's office, you have to be willing to ask questions that turn out to be not the right questions to ask, or to have read something and not quite have gotten it yet, but know that the person you're asking very likely will be happy to correct you and find commonality, right? So I suppose it's both. I suppose it's both a bravery and a foolishness,
Hmm.
right,
Hmm.
to do this kind of work. I will say that my father, oh, a very very long time ago, he took me to a lecture by Stephen Jay Gould,
Hmm.
who was actually a brilliant speaker. Not everybody who's good at these things, at the public communication of science, is necessarily good on stage. You know what I mean?
Sure,
You
sure.
can be good on a page and not on a
Mm.
stage. That's very much a thing. He was really good at both, it turned out. And it was just, I remember going home and having just like insomnia just because my brain would not shut up. I was just so goddamn inspired. So yeah, my direct training helped me for the book for the brain chapter because I had some training in evolution of cognition. I had, taken some seminars over in psych at Columbia. I had some prep there, and of course, growing up the way I did, and of course for the voice chapter in the evolution of language.
Mm.
But the rest of it, I was climbing physiology mountain.
Well, you definitely know how to do your homework. And there's a beginning part of the book which I'm gonna be very honest, I didn't know this, and I feel somewhat ashamed that I didn't know this. You start the book by talking about this fact that in so many studies across various disciplines, psychology included, women aren't used as subjects for many of these studies. And I was curious about that of why did you want to start there, kind of like to the introduction or preface or whatever it is, to kind of just show how much work needs to be done in scientific research when we talk about, I don't think that invalidates scientific research, but
Mm,
there's a big hole to say, well, if you're going to say these things work across disciplines, whether it's sociology or anthropology or psychology, social psychology, whatever it is, and all of the subjects were college students that were, white dudes or whatever. Again, nothing wrong with that, but to then apply that or kind of extrapolate that for women, and they weren't used as subjects or very minimal use. That there's a big issue there, and even up until more recently, it's not like there's this big push that's been where women are used as subjects as much as they probably should. So I was curious about why you start the book there to kind of introduce us into this story you're going to tell about the 200 million years of human body.
So, actually, to my understanding, psych is one of the few spaces of research where there are a lot of female subjects, but they're mostly white
Mhm.
and well educated and of a certain socioeconomic class, the so called weird problem,
Yeah, yeah,
right? That psychology and psychological research is trying to face down right now. Um, so, in fact, because of that, because I'd grown up watching my father build his labs at various universities, first Emory and then Georgia Tech, and then all the way out to Butler in Indianapolis, I just kept seeing a lot of women in the lab, and I saw a lot of women being subjects, and so I just assumed that was just kind of
mm,
like
mm,
all of science definitely has a spread of male and female subjects. They do seem suspiciously white, but other than that, okay,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
Um, and so actually it was a moment at Columbia that convinced that when not convinced me. It was a moment at Columbia when I first learned that the male norm was very much a thing in the biological sciences. Because remember, I had never worked with mouse, I had never worked with freaking rodents or even primates, like that was not I did computational stuff. My laptop was my lab. Um, so I was we were out, a group of us. I was friends with a lot of neuroscience postdocs, one of whom was a collaborator, but otherwise just friends, a group of people at Columbia, and we were having a drink on campus. And this friend, who was actually in a Nobel laureate's lab, but I obviously can't say who,
sure.
um, was giving his normal presentation of his data, right? So he's like, okay, please don't fire me. Here are my very attractive graphs that I have made for you to show that I have done the good sciencing, and please keep supporting me, dear Lord of mine, right? So, which is always that terrifying moment. But anyway, so it turned out that the scientific story that he and his advisor, his PI rather, had wanted to chase down wasn't very interesting. But because he happened to be collaborating with another lab, he happened to use a large number of both male and female rodents. I believe it was mouse. Um, to do their experiments, and the sex differences, oh my goodness, it was a very strong signal. So strong, in fact, that he was suspicious and he ran the experiment again.
Mm,
Right. And so he presented that to his PI and said, hey, look, I think this is what we need to chase down. And the PI sat back in his chair and said, I think it's an artifact. In other words, I think there's something wrong with your data or how you analyzed or how you did it. In other words, go do the experiment again. And my friend, told me that he said to the guy, no, no, did it twice. Here it is. Did all look at very nice looking graph. Look at those margins of error. They're so nice and small. See? And and no, the guy wasn't interested. He was like, I just don't think that we should go back to our original question,
mm,
you know?
mm,
And that's when I found out that actually most of biological research is only using male bodies. This is finally starting to change, but for the last half century or so of research, the way that they controlled for the messiness of cycling female mammalian hormones was to just not use females in the subject pool, which admittedly is one way to handle it, I guess. It's certainly the cheapest
That's
way
one
when you
way,
think
yes.
about it. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's just slightly a problem when you start thinking about what it means to build a model,
Sure.
right,
Yeah.
of one thing or another as a target of study. And it certainly matters when you remember that most biological research starts in basic research, but then if there are applications, if there are things that might go into biomed, in other words, might be applicable to human beings, might even develop into a drug we might take, you know, all of the research that then goes into the start of a clinical trial is based on basic research where there's a huge gap in knowledge about female bodies. And then on the other hand, since the 1970s, we had these rules in the United States and elsewhere that you weren't supposed to include women in of reproductive age in your subject pool because of the fear that we don't know what's going to be teratogenic. We don't know what's going to hurt unborn children. So even if she's not pregnant right now, she could get pregnant.
Mm.
Or if she is pregnant, definitely don't include her because that's a confound, right? So effectively, from the 1970s until the 1990s, when we finally changed the rules, um, no women of reproductive age were included in biomedical research or clinical trials. And reproductive age, just as a reminder for your listeners, is anywhere around 11 or
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
until somewhere in your 50s.
Mhm.
So that's most of my
Yeah,
life.
that's
Yep.
most yes.
That's mostly me as an adult. Yeah, which is an obvious gap. And
Yeah.
we're only just now starting to realize how many of the medicines on the market have been either never properly tested in clinical settings and research settings before coming to market, or if they were, the experiments were improperly done, or it was never analyzed for sex differences because there was an assumption it didn't matter.
Mm.
And only now are we starting to do things like adjust dosing regimens,
Mm.
depending whether you're a male or a female patient. So the reason I start the book there is, well, first of all, it's because that's what finally kicked me in the butt, and I decided, yes, okay, I'm going to write the book.
Mm.
Because in part, I was kind of like, I didn't know if I was the right person to write a book. I'd never written a prose book before. I'd written scientific papers and I'd written poems and some very bad songs at some point in the 90s, which thankfully do not exist on the internet, right? But like I'd never written a book like this before, and I didn't know if I was the right person. But it's I mean it's a moral imperative.
Mm.
Nobody had written
Mm.
such a book before, and it was very much a problem that we weren't paying attention to sex differences. So I'm like, all right, fine. All right, fine. This is why this book needs to exist.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's I'm going back to the piece you said there about, we need to have a kind of model of sorts, right? And I think in many
Yep.
ways, all of the Eves that you introduce us to are kind of, in an evolutionary sense, building off one another in some ways with each of their own distinctive kind of characteristics. But it's important to see that history and the time frame of what it is to have a model of the female body. So I think the work is super important. So you do 200 million years. So this takes us time of the dinosaurs, and you start with
Hmm.
the one of the ancient land mammals, very very small critter called morgie is the short term. There's a
Yep.
there's a longer term, and you use this.
Morganocodon.
Yeah, you use this animal to talk about milk.
Mhm.
And so I think listeners may know that there was a period where animals would lay eggs, and at a certain point, there was this a jump to having milk. And so then, obviously, evolving breasts to have milk, and this is the thing that makes us mammalian, right? It's one all mammals lack. So what is that transition, right? We have obviously the three types of mammals, the monotremes, not as many around, marsupials and placentals. But maybe talk about that. Why Morgie is the important character here for that kind of story of the transition from eggs to breast and with milk.
Yeah. So, one of the deep reasons that I structure the book the way I do, moving essentially forward in time from the dawn of mammals or mammalia forms as we understand them, up through the human species today, isn't just a narrative device. It's also reflective of this deep assumption that we make in biology, which is there's a reason to have a model in rodent,
Mm.
which is to say there's an assumption that certain traits are conserved over evolutionary time. That the reason it's informative to see something like an analog of Alzheimer's or an analog of X or Y, in a mouse is because it may well still kind of work that way by the time you get up to human,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So in other words, like moving and when you do find a target of research in say a mouse model. Now I'm talking about biomed here, but in general, this is true in biology. You often then want to essentially move up the evolutionary chain because you would start maybe in rodent, but then you would collaborate and might move into primate, and before you move into human clinical, right? So in other words, you would go up and see if this thing that you're seeing still works in what is essentially a later version or more recent version of mammal on the way to our body plan, right? So it's both the story of our evolution, but it's also reflective very much of how we think
Mm.
in the biological sciences, right? That this is where this stuff is coming from, and we can learn things about ourselves by looking back at things that are more ancient.
Mm.
So I start with Morgie, in part because I think it becomes one of the first moments that we have a trait that places us where we are in the taxonomic tree that has a very significant sex difference. You know, so there are proto mammals, and then before that, mammalian like lizards, way before 200 million years ago, the theraspids and other sorts of things that are having some of the traits that will build into that mammalian body plan, right? Again, I'm talking about super deep time here. So
Hmm.
huge stretches way back. But the reason then to pick someone like Morganocodon is that once you arrive at lactation, then you're really changing the game for how sex differences are going to build out in that mammalian evolutionary path. And importantly, how mammals in general are going to work a little bit differently because of how we make and care for our offspring.
There's these interesting pieces that come into play with the notion of providing milk. And there's some really fascinating things that you talk about with breast and with milk. The fact that 90% of breast milk is water.
Yep.
That. um,
Of course, we're also a lot of water too. Just assume all life is a lot of water. So
sure.
that's not the surprising feature necessarily. Maybe 90% is surprising.
90% is
Um,
surprising, yeah.
yeah,
And that they're filled with lots of things, blood, fat, tissue. It's not just milk, and that
right.
they can only hold a tablespoon of milk at a time. You talk about this
Yeah, yeah,
letdown
yeah. These
reflex.
aren't sloshing bags.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, I guess tell us about how, we know it today, some of the aspects or the kind of, um the variables or the facts that we know about breast today and many of the different functions, and then kind of like how we've got there, because it didn't they started, I think you see this in other mammals where it was kind of like the younglings would, like, kind of suck through the fur on top. It wasn't actual breast.
They
And
kinda lap it up.
yeah,
It's not even a sucking. Yeah.
yeah, and but
It's
we
kind
don't
of a
have that
more of
now.
a slurp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have that now.
Well, actually, I don't know about echidna. I think maybe the echidna as well, but I do know the duck-billed platypus, which is the monotreme,
Ah, yeah, yeah.
which is often assumed to be a bit, in some ways, like a basal mammal,
Mm.
still lays eggs.
Mhm.
Also, no nipple there.
Mhm.
No nipple. Nipple is an add-on feature that comes later. Milk starts before nipple. And milk glands, evolved from ancient endocrine glands, which are the same kind of thing that makes sweat,
Mhm.
essentially, and oil, sebaceous glands, in your skin,
Mm.
right? So milk starts, in other words, as something skin is making.
Mm.
Um, it starts in kind of an admittedly kind of gross way. I'll just be upfront about that. Kind of gross. So we're egg layers, and a lot, but we're not hard egg layers. Don't picture like a chicken egg. Picture like a leathery lizard-like
Mm.
kind of egg.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Soft shell, in other words.
Mhm.
And the thing about soft shells is you need to keep them damp,
Mhm.
right? Because that offspring is still developing in there, and dehydration is a problem.
Mm.
Because again, all land based mammals need water,
Yeah.
and that includes in early in development. So you can't have a shriveled up, dried out egg. You need to keep it moist. So a lot of creatures today that lay leathery eggs will often secrete a kind of mucousy goo, frankly, that is full of antifungal and antibacterial
Mm.
material, actually. Because remember, if you're keeping something moist by coating it in goo, well, then it's just a festering breeding
Mhm.
ground for
Mhm.
parasites and fungus, and you don't want, like, your eggs to be like a week-old moldy bread,
Mhm.
right? You want them, in fact, to not be hideously infected and grown over. So it evolves, in other words, this egg goo
Mhm.
to coat the eggs in this useful little moist packet to help regulate that water until the leather eggs ready to hatch. Now, among mammals that do that, not mammals, sorry, among animals that do that today, many of them will lap up some of the stuff when they first hatch.
Mm.
It's kind of like their first meal a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
And the assumption is this is how milk starts too,
Mm.
right? That it starts just by licking up this stuff, and eventually there's some glands down in the lower abdomen that start secreting more of the stuff because it gives their kids a boost, and then eventually turns into this water delivery system that we call milk. But we should think about it, in other words, as the start of this immunological advantage that the mother's body is offering to the offspring in their early, very vulnerable period of life when their own immune systems haven't really, you know, they're not able to do everything yet,
Mm.
right? So, not simply to protect the eggs, but then also in early in development to give that immunological boost. And then eventually, speaking of immunology, it gives you water
Mm.
because water is just a known zone for pathogens. It's like very, very easy to contract any of a host of bacteria or viruses or any of other, not great stuff through water sources when they're not clean.
Mm.
And of course, there's no potable water 200 million years ago. There's no like filtration system. So if you can think of the mother's body as a kind of filtration system,
Mm.
right? Her pups are then getting all of their water through the mother's body in early development
Mm.
by having lactation, by having milk, right? Which means they're again shielded from infectious agents and other kinds of problems in those critical early phases of life. So there are known advantages having a milk-based reproduction plan, right? Obviously, the majority of the animal world, by most measures, still lay eggs, and I would argue it still seems to be a better system than what we do with live birth. But lactation, at least, has some good stuff going for it.
It's just so fascinating because you're talking about this kind of water delivery system, but you also have these elements in humans of we know that there's this importance of prolactin and oxytocin, but then the role
Mhm.
of attachment that comes with mothers and children. Also, cortisol is involved. How do we understand, or how? I mean, I know there's been good amounts of studies that have looked at the psychological and emotional and mental development as well, not just the physical nutrients that breast milk can give. So, how do we get to that piece? Was there this piece of like, well, as our brains have continued to evolve, we need stuff at certain points, or how do we get to this component of it from an evolutionary scale?
So, what I hear you asking is you're interested in the features of parent offspring bonding
Uh-huh.
that seem to be built into
Yep.
lactation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Now, yep. So, I absolutely agree with you that it is a really critical period of interaction between mother and offspring, as true for a mouse and an ancient weasel rat like Morgie,
Mhm.
as it is for human beings today. You're spending a lot of time with your offspring, with that offspring literally attached to your abdomen or chest wall, and there's just a lot of cross communication happening there. And as I write about in the book, some of that communication is chemical, effectively, in both directions,
Mhm.
and some of that communication is more overtly behavioral and social,
Mhm.
right? And in human, you might want to call brain based.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now, like I say in the book, I think oxytocin is a little bit too buzzy.
Mhm.
We do and don't know what oxytocin does. It's gotten a lot of very frilly sorts of reps, like it's for bonding and it's gonna play into your monogamy. And oxytocin apparently is for anything that's feel good,
Yes. Yes.
which is and isn't actually true. Some of that research is good, and some of it's frankly a little bit
It's
garbage,
bunk.
right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what we do know oxytocin for sure does, which is probably how this originally evolves, is that it's really good at making certain kinds of muscles contract.
Mm.
That's what it's actually really, really good at. So the reason oxytocin is listed as one of the WHO's critical medicines for global health is that it induces labor.
Mm,
Actually, oxytocin, if you're inducing labor, you give a patient a big fat dose of oxy, and that uterus is going to start contracting and will eventually go into labor. Likewise, we know that oxytocin is involved in the so-called letdown reflex in milk production, right? Milk is this co-produced biological product. And what I mean by that is that, as you say, and I say in the book, we're not carrying a couple jugs of milk sloshing around in there when we're
mhm,
breastfeeding. It's only a couple tablespoons in all of those gland ducts. The sucking itself, the action that stimulates the breast, triggers what's called a letdown reflex, which tells the milk glands, okay, it's time to start gearing up production and pushing it down the tubes towards the nipple and towards the offspring, right? And we know that oxytocin is likewise involved in that signaling pathway for that letdown reflex, that it's making basically tissue in the breast contract to squeeze the milk out. Right? So oxytocin's really good at squeezing,
mm,
right? That's what it's for. All of these add-on perks
mm,
that seem to maybe be involved with bonding and deep brain stuff and maybe sexuality, unclear, is definitely like a later add-on feature
mm,
to just the basic squeeziness
mm,
of that little guy.
mm. So, so there's another question here, kind of off of that. Is there's obviously what you're talking about is, the functionality of breast and of milk, but then we also have other things as social animals, social primates that we've heard a lot of ideas about. And you kind of, in the book, you kind of acknowledge it, but don't put a lot of maybe emphasis on it as maybe as other people do. I know plenty of folks that are in evolutionary psych world, and they like to put a lot of emphasis on waist to hip ratio in terms of sexual ornamentation, things like that. And
I mean, it makes an appearance in my book.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wasted, yeah.
You don't flat out kind of deny those things, but I think you maybe say that there's too much emphasis on that. So so here's the question. The question is
Mm,
that in terms of how society looks at breast as evolutionary payoffs, right? Is it
mm,
true that they they are used for those things such as sexual ornamentation, sexual selection,
mhm,
for arousal and
mhm,
attraction, things like that?
mhm.
Or is that overplayed too much? Is that not always the case? So where do you kind of, I guess, land here?
Well, I mean, I think it's always useful to have a healthy suspicion of any research that seems deeply culturally guided
Mm,
and not necessarily data based.
mm.
That doesn't mean it's never true. I just mean that it's good to have a nice, healthy, just carry that, not just a pinch, carry like a little bag of salt around with you and just be like, I don't know, be ready to be skeptical because, remember that science is not simply the data, but the interpretation of the
Mhm,
data
mhm,
and the design of an experiment. And there's a lot of of the social situation of the scientists involved that inevitably play into how we understand what we see.
mm,
Yeah.
mm,
So I've heard some very good theories for why human beings have the sort of breast that we do, and I've heard some astonishingly bad ones. And I give a kind of overview of some of those
mhm,
in the book. Um, Easily the worst theory I've heard for why human beings have breasts. And again, by this now I mean not simply that we lactate and have nipples and glandular tissue,
mhm,
right? That's just sort of like we know why we have that because we're mammals.
mhm,
That's clear.
mhm.
Actually, you have it too. It's just that because of your SRY gene, it just didn't develop as much as mine. But you actually
Right.
not only have nipples, you also
Can lactate.
have, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, you can very much lactate. You actually have breast tissue, your mammary tissue under there.
yeah.
It's just very flat and small. Anyway, moving on. Enough about your chest, right? So we know why we have that, in other words. That's like no one's arguing about that.
Yeah.
The argument is what all this extra fat and like pendulous quality and shape is for,
Mhm,
right? And because so many heterosexual men are attracted to these things, one is tempted to build a theory around it being a sexually selected trait.
sure.
That doesn't mean it's not, but it's useful to be suspicious.
Mm,
Because, for example, here's a very bad theory I heard. So the theory essentially goes like this. And the assumption is that the breast is a show trait, sexually selected, that males like to look at it. And if the female had it, then she got more sex and had more babies. And ta-da, evolution.
Mhm.
Yeah. A runaway trait, in other words, a sexually selected trait, right? Okay. So apparently we used to walk on four legs, but then at some point we stood up.
Mhm.
And that meant that all of a sudden our butt wasn't at eye level anymore, but our breasts were. And so breasts evolved to look like a butt, and that would turn guys on. Not kidding. This is in a peer-reviewed journal. I know.
It's
I know.
definitely a theory. That's a theory for sure.
I'm like, well, that's a theoretical choice. Okay. And I did my best to kind of like find it plausible and just could not get there. Just could not. I just don't think that my chest looks like a butt. I just don't. I know there are two mounds and mine are a bit bigger than some other women's, but actually when you look at the wide diversity of breast shape in the human species
Mhm.
today, um, that's actually one of the best evidence against extra large breasts being the most successful version of a breast. Actually, we have widely divergent breast shapes and sizes,
Mhm.
right? And likewise, breasts that have any amount of size to them don't actually look very butt-like after there's been a few babies and suckling. As anybody who's looked at old editions of National Geographic will be happy to tell you, they look more like kind of pointy pancakes. You know what I mean? So that's not a high mound. You
Yeah.
see what I mean? So given that we haven't been wearing underwire bras in the 300,000 year history of our species, right? It seems unlikely that that's the best indicative, right, of the shape. However, one of the better arguments I've heard for the shape itself being something that's useful was tied to a functionality rather than an attractiveness, rather than a sexually selected trait. So, because we have flat faces
Mhm.
compared to other primates, our muzzles are kind of squashed up against under our eyes, right? And our noses, however big one is or isn't with the cartilage, it's still much shorter
Mhm.
than your average ape. Yeah. And that means that our newborns, when they're smushed up against our breast tissue, suckling in early life, if they do, uh, well, can't really breathe very well
Mm.
because the nostril is, with a different breast shape. So there was an argument that maybe this sort of teardrop shape with a slight up tilt might help keep a nostril or two free so that the poor kid can breathe while
Mhm.
trying to also drink and eat, right? And I thought that was a pretty good theory too. Again, I didn't know how to resolve that with the inevitable more pancake shape in a non-broad person, which is just again a very natural, normal thing. Presumably in the ancient history of our species would have been true, right?
Mm.
So like, I don't know. I don't know how to resolve that exactly.
Mm.
So my feeling is more than likely it evolved somehow for the more obvious important effort, which is successfully lactating and nursing a baby. And then any add-on sexiness perk would have come later.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting how there's still questions that are still there, or
Yeah,
potential
yeah.
questions that are there. It's like, oh, we don't. There's still things about us that we've known forever. It seems like, but there's still things that are kind of question marks of like, well, we're not too sure, or maybe it makes sense here, but it might not make sense later, which is really interesting. That's why we keep doing good research and things like that.
Mm,
So okay, so let's move to the womb. This
mhm.
was probably the most fascinating part, one of the most fascinating parts of the book. But there's a lot of material in here, so I'll try and do very general sweep and then maybe some details here. But you mentioned that the female body became a gestation machine, and that having eggs incubate inside the body, and this development of a placenta. So there's in the book, listeners should get the book, but they can't see the picture. There's this fascinating. I've heard this before, and it's a fascinating thing in development of when you have a fetus at 6 weeks
Mhm.
in the development of genitals. 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 20 weeks. 20 weeks is where you kind of get difference, if you will. But
Mhm.
before that, I mean, it's the same. It's basically the same for kind of
Oh,
traditionally
yeah, yeah,
male
they're called
humans.
genital buds.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The
that's
formation of
fascinating.
our undercarriage, when we're, in these early stages of development are remarkably very much the same thing for a long time.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
also true that in urogenital development, because remember that you're developing not simply genitals, but where your urethra is going to go,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because
Right.
it's all in the human species, it's all very, that's a critical developmental feature
Hmm.
of what's going on in our crotch. It's one of the most common sites of divergence, or in some cases, malformation
Hmm.
in males and females, but actually, especially in males.
Hmm.
Having a urethra go kind of funky is a very common thing in a cis male baby.
Wow.
Yep. And it's often a simple surgery to fix.
Hmm. Interesting. There's this piece on in the book where you kind of get this image, so you can help me kind of explain this. So you talk about it with different mammals.
Mhm.
So there are differences with mammals and their different vaginas. Monotremes
Oh, yeah.
have, how do you say this? A cloaca? How do you say this?
I believe it's cloaca.
Cloaca.
I Yeah, I don't think it's cloaca. Pretty sure
Okay,
it's
okay, okay.
cloaca.
Cloaca, and then they lay eggs. Marsupials have two holes and then a pouch. Is this right?
Yes.
And
The
then
pouch is up front, but the pouch doesn't have a hole. The
okay,
pouch is just a pouch with some nipples inside.
and then
Yep.
you have eutherians, and they have three. Is this right?
Eutherians. We
Eutherians.
have a three-hold plan
Yeah.
in the female. In
Mhm.
the female, we have a three-hole plan. The marsupials almost always have a two-hole plan,
Mhm.
what's called a urogenital sinus, where both urine and the reproductive organs deposit their wares, to exit the body,
Mhm.
and a rectum out back. And the echidna and the duckbill platypus, the monotremes, which are assumed to be, in some ways, more representative of very basal mammals, where all of us came from, in other words, all three of these mammal types,
Mhm.
who still lay eggs and still only have one hole,
Mhm.
hence monotreme.
Mhm.
Actually, the mono is representing literally the one hole they got in the back, which is exactly the same as what a bird has.
Mm.
A bird actually doesn't have a butt. A bird has one hole.
Mm.
And so do monotremes and the duck-billed platypus, where all three of their major out paths on
Mm.
the bottom end, which is the rectal opening, the urethra where your urine goes, and your reproductive material, which for them would be where the egg rolls out. It's
Mhm.
all coming out basically the same sinus, the same hole
Mm.
behind a single purse string opening. Yeah. So one of the key divergences in our evolution was the split from a common ancestor that eventually became, marsupials or the placental eutherians like us, um, which in many ways involved having a two-hole plan or a three-hole plan.
Mhm.
And there are advantages to either,
Mm.
depending who you ask. But that is one of the key differences there. One of the really critical things that happened actually was not down in the holes exactly, the where things come out of the body,
Mhm.
but actually how the tubing is arranged in the lower pelvis.
Mhm. Mm.
So the thing is that marsupials, again, easiest way to remember that is they have a pouch and we don't, right? So the marsupials have a pouch.
Mhm.
Think kangaroo, think possum. So they have their ureters, and that's the tubes that connect from your kidneys to your bladder.
Mhm.
Right? Remember, your kidneys make the pee, goes down the tube into the bladder, then out the body through the urethra. So that now you can picture that set of tubing. Right. So their ureters, the tubes going to their bladder from their kidneys, go in between multiple vaginas. Okay. So they have a single urogenital sinus, which is where both their pee and their reproductive material come out. But the thing that's connecting their bladder to the kidneys is literally going in between like a weirdly designed bad highway system, between those vaginas. And what that means effectively, besides just like, oh, that's an anatomical quirk,
Mhm.
is that they can't have very big babies come out their vaginas.
Mhm.
Now, remember, they have multiple vaginas because they have two uteri, as do many mammals still today. Our uterus is merged uh, from two organs,
Mm.
which once upon a time were the shell glands,
Mm.
right? So, anyway, so you can't have very big babies come out of tubing that is directly adjacent to your ureters because you're very likely to tear open your tubing inside as the thing comes out and then you die of nitrous poisoning,
Mm.
basically. There's a reason you want pee to come out of your body. It would poison you
Yeah.
otherwise,
Right.
right? So they had a basic limitation in their body plan.
Mm,
That's the theory anyway.
mm,
That for whatever reason we didn't. We had our ureters in the right spot, and so we were able to build bigger and bigger babies without having to have them come out as teeny tiny jelly beans.
mhm, mhm. So you mentioned, yeah, you mentioned it there, and you mentioned in the book is that marsupials have one vagina for each uterus, so they have
Yep.
like two, right?
They have a minimum of 2. They sometimes also have 3, so the sperm comes up the sides and then the baby comes out the middle. Sometimes they'll even have 4, I believe. Sometimes it's in place all the time, and sometimes it's spontaneously created at the moment of birth. Marsupials are weird.
That's so
Um,
wild.
yeah,
Wow, wow.
I know.
We,
I know. I mean, personally, I think it'd be a lot of fun to have some extra vaginas. I don't know what I could do with them, but it could be cool. But but I'm glad to not have pee ripped out through my
yeah,
whole body trying to have a baby.
that doesn't sound good.
No.
But humans have one in one, right? It's one,
Yep.
yeah. S-
The vast majority of us, not all,
mm,
actually, not all. It is divergent paths in the development of typical female reproductive organs, including the uterus and the vagina. Sometimes go a little bit awry in ways that look suspiciously like how the thing evolved in the first place.
huh,
So the most common thing is that it's a little bit heart shaped. There's a little dent in the top,
interesting.
and lots and lots and lots of women have that.
Mm,
Doesn't seem to cause any problem. Then again, slightly less common, but still common. You have what's called a septate uterus, where you have this fibrous kind of band of tissue kind of down the middle of the uterus,
mm,
but it stops about halfway down,
mm,
right? So you can kind of picture like a very heart shaped
mm,
kind of thing.
mm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Um, uh, Still a thing that happens. You have 2 whole uteri connected
Wow.
to uh, well, it's almost as if it's horned with 1 cervix and 1 vagina. Sometimes you'll have 2 cervices with 2 uteruses uteri, and a single vagina, and sometimes you'll even have a double vagina.
Wow.
Um, that's the most rare, a
Wow.
dual uterus and dual, vagina. But as provide illustrations of all of these in the book.
You do, yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 which is just kind of wild to realize, but,
Well, it's very
what I
helpful.
found
It's very
cool about
helpful.
that.
Very, very, very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 so you know what the hell I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 and those were just, an illustrator worked with me to create them based on some anatomical textbooks, so I
Mhm.
just knew that everybody could see what the hell I was talking about here. What I found cool about it is that not all, developmental snafus betray our evolutionary past necessarily.
Mm,
Sometimes they just arrive kind of spontaneously and it doesn't say anything to do with our past. But uterine malformations and their commonality are actually deeply indicative of
mm.
our evolutionary path.
Wow. Wow, that's super fascinating. And then there's this coevolution for males. So the for marsupials, the males will have, not, I guess they don't have two penises, but they have like,
They have a forked penis usually.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 2 heads. Or like the echidna, which has 4,
Right, right.
like a clover
Four
leaf.
leaf. Well, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Clover leaf.
yeah.
Yeah, 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 which oh god, I love those weird little guys so much.
Yeah.
So they only ever erect 2 of their penile heads at once when
Mm,
they have, sex with a female, but then the next time they have sex with a female, they'll erect the opposite 2, like a weird game of, like, sexual whack-a-mole, and it's just and that's just how they do that. That's just how they do
that
that.
is
So feel free to explore the internet,
yeah.
it's wild out there.
That is so strange, and I mean, for us as humans. So it's, but the point I make there is that it is interesting how you do see this coevolution, right?
Yeah.
There's a purpose and utility there of sorts of like, okay, this wasn't just random, or this wasn't just like a whoops or something like that. Like there you do see the functionality of it, even on both sides where there's male and female populating.
Yeah, well, I would just offer that all evolution is a whoops. It's just that some of those accidents then turn out to be beneficial, and then if they're genetically built, are selected for over time,
Mm.
right? So everything's a whoops. It's
Mhm.
just some whoops helped.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's a good way of saying it. So tell us real quick about the placenta. It's a very interesting
Mm.
uh, um, part of the story of how things have evolved that we obviously still have today. I mean, you've heard these stories, right? Where people will eat the placenta. Have you heard about this, right? Where some people will
People do all kinds of
do
crazy
some
stuff.
interesting things there. There's some nutritional value there. I don't know, but tell us about
I
the.
mean, it's not that different from eating a weird cut of meat. I don't
That's
feel
what
the
I've heard.
motivation.
That's what I hear.
There is plenty of placental eating in other apes,
Mm-hmm.
and some other non-ape primates as well. Um, I am always suspicious about, cultural trends where we start doing stuff with the argument that our ancestors did it, and therefore it's what we should do.
Mm-hmm.
Our ancestors did all kinds of stuff that we may not necessarily want to do. So more power to the people who want to eat bits of their own body effectively, but not me.
Yeah.
Wasn't into that.
Yeah. So tell us about the function of the placenta. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
stores what the uterus, all these things, but or the fetus. But what is the story there with the placenta and all the maybe some of the different parts and stuff?
The big story of the placenta and why it matters so much that ours is the way it is and that marsupials are generally not that way is that our placenta is deeply invasive. That means the blood vessels of the placenta penetrate all the way down into the mother's bloodstream with interlocking blood vessels and exchange. Now, most marsupial placentas kind of pop off. They look like a teeny little disc, and when it's time for that very tiny jelly bean to literally crawl its way out of mom and up into her pouch with its weirdly strongly developed forelimbs, usually, and totally underdeveloped rear leg buds, which is definitely alien looking. I've seen videos.
Mm.
Um, like they don't have to, there isn't a lot of detachment that needs to happen because there wasn't all that much development, which is to say, resource pulling from the mother's uterus before it was time for them to go into pouch phase,
Mm.
right? Now, with the way we do it, there's a range of how invasive our placentas are. Like a mouse placenta is still pretty shallow.
Mm.
Not it depends on the species of rodent, but generally think of it still as a tiny little disc. Because the placenta, I should start maybe earlier and just remind folk that the placenta is that big fleshy dinner plate looking thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the embryo and the amniotic sac is attaching to the uterus, right? That's how it docks on. It's true that the fetus is essentially free floating in that fluid inside the womb, inside the amniotic sac, but it is attached to the freaking uterus. Of course it is, because that's how it's getting all of its nutrients, and blood and liquid and everything else that it needs to grow out a whole new body, right? So our placenta, the human placenta, is wildly invasive. And actually, it does have something in common with a few other species that menstruate the way we do.
Mm.
So, the big story of human menstruation is not that we very annoyingly and awkwardly and sometimes embarrassingly shed material out of our vaginas. It's true that I would love for that to stop. Highly recommend IUDs, people. It does limit that problem, but nonetheless, if it's right for you, um, if you have a uterus and it's right for you. But it's like it's obviously just a thing that our body does, but that's actually not the big story of menstruation. It's not that it happens externally. The big thing that's interesting about what we do is that we start building up the uterine lining before an embryo is even coming down the pipe.
Mm.
Now, in most mammals, the uterine lining starts building up in response to chemical signaling
Mm.
from a fertilized egg that's coming down the fallopian tubes. Okay, that's when you start making that thick, plushy bed, which in humans and some other species is then shed if nothing implants, right? Because for those of you who know what menstruation is, right? So what we do is we start building it up before we even get that signal. And there are a number of species that do that as well.
Mm.
It turns out some other great apes, and weirdly, I think the elephant shrew. Anyway, so the thing that's common among all of those who have that spontaneous deciduation is we all have really invasive placentas. Like the medium invasive and the shallow placentas, no, 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 no. You don't start building up a line. You all good, right?
Mm.
But for those of us who have an incoming weapon of mass destruction effectively, coming down the tube, something that's really gonna hot dock in very deeply to the uterine wall, we start building up a thick lining, not only for the idea of supporting such a pregnancy, but also to protect the mother's body,
Mm.
right? Because if you don't have a nice thick lining, then that very invasive placenta is going to go into your outer uterine wall, and you do not want that.
Mm,
That is very, very bad. That's all kinds of hemorrhage and,
mm,
death.
mm,
That's a whole lot of death.
mhm,
You don't want that, right? Well, not for every woman, but you know what I mean.
mhm.
So so that's actually the big story for why we menstruate. We menstruate because human pregnancy is like trench warfare, right? There is maternal fetal competition for resources within the environment of the womb, with the fetus long evolving to get as many nutrients as it can, and the mother's body long evolving to survive this crazy process of how we make babies the way we do,
Mm.
right? So it's not that pregnancy is this wonderful, warm, long period of just cuddling and supporting a growing fetus. It's more like a détente. It's more like it's like a 9-month conflict where it's kind of a stalemate and neither side wins quite too much. And then there's birth.
Mm.
It's more like that.
But that's not the story that we hear in sex ed class or whatever it is in high school or whatever.
No.
Why don't we hear this story, right? Like this seems more accurate. I mean, we do kind of get that kind of it's a woman's body preparing for pregnancy, whatever, which isn't entirely untrue, but it's definitely not the way in which you're describing it. Why do you think we still get
Right.
that story in sex ed class or wherever?
Oh, that's probably just sexism. Um, I mean, like, usually the answer, as you see in my book, it's often not the case that the answer is so simple as, "Oh, it's just sexism." Usually there are, like, deep, complex reasons why we
Mm,
think things we do about female bodies, but, like, why we've assumed for so long that, like, pregnancy is good for a woman's body, or that, that it is our destiny to become pregnant, and everything our body does is to support a baby.
mm,
Well, that's just because of very cultural ideas about what women are for and what our
mm,
bodies are for. It turns out we are not simply empty vessels
mm,
waiting to be filled. That, in fact, we are complex members of a complex social species that reproduce,
mm.
that make our babies the way we do, in a way that's actually very dangerous.
Yeah.
That's long evolved to be kind of a shit show, frankly. Um, and so, menstruation is actually more of a self-protective
Mm,
feature in
mm,
that sense. So yeah, so the reason we don't tell that story usually is one, it took a long time in the biological sciences to accept the idea of maternal fetal conflict
mm.
because it goes against that idea of what we have about mothers, basically, and what females are kind of for in that deep
But
sense. You know what I mean?
I mean, I get it,
Um,
but that's not but it's not accurate. But it's not an accurate thing. It's not placing the
what, you think
central person.
eugenics was accurate? Like, yeah. Like, come on, there's a lot in the history of science that was, like, clearly a bad idea, okay? Eugenics is not accurate. That pregnancy is innately good for a woman's body, not accurate. Like, okay, alright, but then we get closer to the truth, and we just move on and try not to make such hideous mistakes again.
Well, this ties into the beginning part of your book of that whole thing of, like, where you don't have the, like, if you're studying the female body, that person should be central, right? Like that person should be like, well, what is it from? How do we trying to understand how the female body works from that perspective? Not in this case, males just trying to say, paint whatever story or have these things. Like I think you have to have it from this perspective of like, yeah, like you're gonna know best about your body. We should have people that are studying female reproduction in a way that is as close as you can to being accurate, not creating a just so story or some other kind of story that, makes whatever your cultural implications feel good. I mean that makes sense to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also think, in many cases in the book, a chapter will essentially launch not simply with a description of the Eve, which is a metaphor for something being used as an exemplar or the true last common ancestor
Mm,
of a tree
mhm,
that places us where we are in the taxonomic tree. So each of the chapters in the book is kind of set up that way,
mm,
that here's a new trait, here's a new Eve and her ecological Eden, and what can we learn? Yeah.
mhm,
But it also begins as a kind of thought experiment. Like, okay, here's a trait that we say is very important for mammals. What happens when we ask about the female?
mm,
Does that change the story we tell about this trait?
mm,
Does that change the lens through which we understand what's up here? So the goal isn't always to like make the female the hero or anything. In fact, hero stories are a big problem in science. We're a complex social species, and also our science is done collectively, right? Even a single paper is usually dozens of people working together,
Yeah.
right? So I'm very allergic to a hero story, and it's not my goal to make the female the hero in every case. It's more like we haven't been asking the question, what about the female,
Yeah.
in many cases,
Mhm.
as we build evolutionary models for these traits and we build understandings of what they're doing in the body over deep time and in our bodies now, right? So once you give yourself that assignment of that thought experiment, it opens up many new modes of thought,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
For ways of understanding what went down. It is true in mammals, at least, that while females, I wouldn't say, are more important than males. It's not like that. We're a sexed species, right? So obviously, you can't get a subsequent generation without,
Mhm.
your two sets of gametes there. It's more like because the way mammals reproduce is so obviously costly
Mhm.
for the female. What that means is that divergence in the female body has a bit more pressure.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is when things go wrong in a female body, it's immediately more costly
Mm.
to the species. And when things go right or usefully or a new adaptation accidentally comes along that gives a big leg up, it's going to be that much more advantageous if it's tied to the body that is making the next generation,
Mm.
right? So in that sense, it's also a little bit perverse that we had so clearly neglected the female in our evolution for so long,
Mm.
because we are mammals.
Mm. Yeah, I'll just say from my dude's perspective, I always find I think it's like extremely powerful and like amazing that, women I would not sign up to do any of those things. None of that sounds great. Doesn't sound like a good time. And
Mm,
I always so it's interesting for me because I'm never going to me personally, I'm never going to have those experiences. So it's always interesting
mm,
to be curious about what that experience is like. But also I always get maybe this is just me, this is from my perspective, but anytime I know of somebody that is pregnant, I get really worried. Not like in the, "Oh, can I hold the
mm.
door open for you or make sure you don't trip and fall?" I get worried about all of the things that could go wrong throughout
Are
9
you an
months.
anxiety-prone person?
No, not typically, not typically.
Okay,
Not typ I mean,
okay.
sometimes, but not typically, but then, like, I think
So
about
pregnancy is a trigger for you for some reason.
I
Yeah,
mean, kind of, yeah, I mean, because like, I think about all the things about like that I've
sure.
read and researched about the female body and that process and like yeah there's some really wonderful parts to it, there's a lot of terrible parts from what many women told me, but then there's like the whole process of labor, which is dangerous in some ways. Like it's not great. I mean, there are risks to doing it. I mean, that's not like I mean, yes, we've done it and there there's doctors that do it like multiple ones every day, but there is always an element of risk. And I always think about that of like yeah, like, we talk about the high points of, like, pregnancy, and it is a kind of a miraculous thing and all I get all that, but, like, it's also kind of risky too. Like, I think of it from a risk perspective, is what I should say.
Oh, and I think that's very smart of you to think of it that way. I think a lot of people struggle to think of it that way, usually because of this idea that, oh, well, it's what the female body has always done. And so you all good, just get yourself some good prenatal care slash midwifery and cheers.
Yeah, no,
We'll pass around the cigar later. Um,
I
and
definitely
then,
don't
of
think that
course,
way.
the general like invisibility of what female bodies go through because of taboo, because we're not
Mhm,
allowed to talk about things. There's just a lot of complex stuff
mhm.
keeping this thing a little bit hidden. But it's also true that just because something is normal doesn't mean it's okay,
Of
right?
course.
Yeah. So it is very normal to give birth the way that we do.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's cool. And in fact, when you look at other species, which of course is something I'm doing a lot in this book, um, it becomes very clear very quickly that human reproduction is a flaming garbage pile, actually.
Yeah,
Not the sex part necessarily. We're both very enthusiastic about that. Generally, as a species, we're into
sure,
that,
yeah,
and like it seems to roughly go okay so long as you don't break the penis. It's all good, and
right,
obviously as long as everything's done with consent between adults.
right.
But the thing about our reproduction beyond that point
Mhm,
is that our pregnancies and births and postpartum recoveries
mhm,
are longer and harder and more prone to crippling and or deadly complications for both mother and offspring. In other words, yeah, we have 8 billion people alive in the world, but we still actually suck at this, right?
Yeah.
Compared to most other primates, except for the squirrel monkey, and we feel really bad for her. But otherwise, right? And that kind of changes how I and many others understand what goes down in hominin evolution,
Hmm.
right? That what's a major problem that these species are facing. And we talk a lot about hunger because obviously food sourcing is a problem and collaborative efforts and climate change and all of the many many things that we did to succeed and survive and thrive. Um, but for an evolutionary biologist, if you're not really great at making babies, that's a hard problem.
Hmm.
That's a full stop. That is a very likely flag for either extinction or like not what you would call great global success,
Hmm.
right? That maybe we should have ended up a curiosity in some other species zoos,
Hmm.
right? That because a lot of other creatures that are bad at reproducing are, and we're trying to conserve them. In
Hmm.
fact, we humans who are also bad at this. Um, and the workaround, of course, was gynecology. So I wasn't the first to say it about midwifery. Through an analysis of pelvic structures,
Hmm.
it seems that Lucy, the Australopithecine, that is hard to say this time of night. Yes, she lived about 3.2 million years ago, and she had a similar obstetric dilemma. She too was trying to fit a watermelon out of a lemon-sized hole, right? So it was a mechanical problem of okay, and so the argument was that she needed a midwife. She needed help getting that thing out of her, right? But and I sign on to that. I'm like, "Yep, that seems true." But remember that that's also just the moment of birth. And what makes human reproduction so troublesome and difficult is actually not simply the moment that you give birth. Any good OB will tell you that the long trajectory of your reproductive life before you get pregnant greatly shapes the likelihood of complications and outcomes in the moment of birth. Likewise, good prenatal care once you are pregnant profoundly impacts how likely what this is going to go one way or another, right? And likewise in postpartum recovery, there's a whole lot of healing to do
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
how we do what we do.
Mm.
And so assistance in that space and medical and social care in that space also greatly determines whether or not you're likely to survive
Mhm.
and your baby too. Now, this isn't to like terrify your pregnant listeners. The point here is simply that in our deeply evolved body plan and social systems, the big problem we needed to overcome was how bad we were at making babies. And the way we overcame it was by using all of our really special, really clever hominin and then human traits, which is clever problem solving and deep interconnected and interdependent sociality and workarounds and adaptability, right? Um, all of those things that we usually praise in the human species today and that we argue is why we managed to succeed was actually used to overcome our most basic problem in inventing gynecology.
Mm. Yeah, well, I was going to say that fully agree that in talking about pregnancy, the fact is that for there, I know there's books and things out there like this for people that are pregnant, and I get it, but um, each pregnancy for each person is going to be different, right? And I think that
Yes.
there's each person's body is different. Even if you've had 7 children, each one's going to be a little bit different, and each person's body
Yep.
is different, and the recovery and all these things. So I think that's also something important to remember. And yeah, you're bringing up Lucy. Is I remember I think it was Jeremy De Silva. He wrote this
Mhm.
great book. It's called First Steps, where he talks about how us becoming or evolving to be bipedal
Mhm.
really shaped and changed a lot of things. It was a great book. We
Mhm.
had a really nice
Yep.
conversation about this, but this was one of them. I remember this is where I really kind of like that light bulb went off in my head. Where he was like,
Mhm.
"Yeah," I think he showed me. This is what a chimpanzee's kind of pelvic structure looks like, their bone structure, and this is the
Mhm.
size of like the chimpanzee baby's head, and it just like
Yep.
right through,
Just drops out.
super easy. And then
Not a prob.
here's a
Yep.
human, and it's like, this does not fit. What are we gonna do?
Ooh.
And so to your point about midwives, and it's very all these ways in which we try to figure out, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? Or otherwise we're gonna be extinct real fast. Okay, and here's the way we do that.
Yeah. I would also just only add to that, we know a lot about the history of potential midwifery because of things that survive in the fossil record, like pelvic structure,
Uh-huh.
potential pelvic structure and bones, literally bones fossilized. Placentas don't.
Mm,
The uterus does not. So there's and because we can only know so much from potential genetic dating, molecular clocks, right?
mm,
With a lot of assumption about how quickly mutations do or don't arise when we try and back solve when did this gene come about.
mm,
You know, um, we don't exactly know. What we do know is that we have very invasive placentas now,
mm,
and one of the arguments for why we might, but I don't know, I'm kind of mixed on this, to be honest, I'll just flag that,
mm,
is that we build a lot of brain in the womb,
mm,
and brain is incredibly expensive metabolic tissue.
mm,
It's some of the most costly stuff you're running in your body, actually. It's like a sports car that lives in your head and is always kept on idle. It takes a lot of gas. I don't know how far I want to push this metaphor, but yeah, it takes a lot of gas. It's incredibly buggy. It requires a lot of expensive fixes. When it goes wrong, it tends to go catastrophically wrong, and it's just living in your head, and you're constantly have to feed this thing, right?
mm,
So, so one of the theories out there for why we've developed our taxing pregnancies the way we have is that as encephalization marches on, and our brain tissue gets bigger, and we're having to do more of that in the womb, well, then the embryo is potentially evolving in ways that hoover down more resources from the mother's body. I don't know. I think I'm kind of 50-50 or maybe 60-40 split on that.
mm,
I haven't settled yet
mm,
if that's the big story of the placenta. I do know that we have a really invasive placenta.
mm,
But the thing about that being important, though, in the idea of it being risky,
mm,
talking about risk, with pregnancy and birth and what have you, is that having a placenta the way we do, it presents a number of problems. It downregulates the mother's immune system. Of course, it does. All mammalian pregnancy does, but invasive placenta species especially so,
mm,
um, because otherwise the mother's immune system would quite rightly try to defend itself from this invader, right? So you have that coevolution,
mhm,
right, of an immune system responding and then an offspring, trying to turn down the dial.
mm,
It affects your blood pressure. It affects your liver functionality. It affects your freaking kidneys.
mm,
Your blood volume goes way up carrying this thing. Which is to say that it's not simply the mechanics of birth, but having that longer pregnancy, which is so metabolically taxing and has so many effects in so many body systems, that provides a number of, well, fail points,
mm,
right? You know? Now, that said, I mean, it just depends how you calculate risk. Technically, there is no point in a human pregnancy that is totally safe
mm,
because many pregnancy complications can develop very quickly. And you go from zero to hemorrhage, kind of fast. And that's more and more true the later in a pregnancy you get. However, modern gynecology is awesome and prenatal care is amazing. And I personally would be very, very dead without it. I would be so deceased multiple times over if it weren't for the amazing care that I received during my pregnancies, both the miscarriages and the babies that I ended up making that are still alive. Last I heard, they're back in Seattle. Um, so, so yeah, you're right. There is no point in a pregnancy that is fully without risk. Personally, I fully support all of those parents who are pregnant and feel really good about what's going down in their bodies and maybe even have a little bit of a hormonal high and are just liking this stuff. I'm like, that's awesome.
mm.
That's great. You do that. Rock on. I think we can say that parents can be fully informed of the risk and still celebrate the fun stuff
Mm.
if you are lucky enough to have it,
Y-
right? We can all admit this sucks
Yeah,
without compromising the innate wonder of pregnancy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think both of those things are true many times at the same time, and I think having those kinds of honest or transparent ways of talking about it, it's a strange thing culturally where if you hear a woman say something negative about while she's pregnant about you know the reality of whatever it may be that's difficult, it's all of a sudden is oh, you're resentful towards your pregnancy or whatever, you're not going to be mom of the year, and it's like that's ridiculous. Like it's not going to always be a bed of roses. That's I mean being a parent is really difficult, and carrying a child is difficult, and I think it's important to be honest about all of the experiences. I think that's really important.
I mean, Xavier, we're just supposed to be so very, very grateful that someone's knocked us up, of course. We're just supposed to pray to God every single day for the wonderful gift that has been rendered inside of our womb. No, I mean, come on now. Like, but it's true. It's true. A lot of us feel that very social pressure, right? To
Yeah,
be
yeah,
the
it's not.
perfect pregnant person and the endlessly grateful mother. And of course, as you know, as a practicing clinician, those kinds of messages, those kinds of stories we tell ourselves
Hmm.
about who we're supposed to be can be really dangerous
Of
in the
course,
postpartum period.
of course, yeah.
Not just dangerous in the most overt sense of postpartum depression and taking your mood seriously if it's really taken a big dip,
Hmm.
right? Which is a problem. And the more open and honest we are about that, the more lives will be saved.
Yeah, yeah.
But also simply just basic coping,
Mm.
just basic coping with something that's already hard. If you're busy telling yourself the story that you're supposed to be endlessly grateful for the seed that has been given to you, then you're not going to have the energy
Mm,
for the difficult thing you're trying to do, becoming a parent.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally agree. So I have two final questions. There's so many things you talk about in the book, which I can't cover everything. So you talk about perception, you talk about intelligence, you talk about so many different things. But I want to ask two things here. The
Mhm.
one thing is about the grandmother hypothesis. So
Yep.
I've talked about this a variety of times on the podcast. It's a very interesting concept, and you had a kind of a new an idea I haven't heard. I don't know if it's new. It's an idea I haven't heard.
Mhm.
Um, do you know? I'm gonna mess this up. Susan Mattern. She wrote the book "The Slow Moon Rises." What's the
I
name?
do not.
It's she's a historian. She writes about the history of menopause,
Oh,
and
cool.
it's really cool. It's a really cool book. She's really lovely,
I'll check it out.
and I think her in the back half of the book, she gives the idea that potentially menopause is a cultural syndrome for folks in the West. Very interesting. Very very.
Hmm.
And so, anyways, but she talks at length about the grandmother hypothesis and goes over many of the same claims and things like that of why um, we see females living past the age uh, of when they're past when they're fertile. So you give the claim. I think you pull from like how we see. I think it's orcas that do this and stuff. That maybe grandmothers and their, I guess you could say, utility is to impart wisdom. You kind of seem to rely
Mhm.
heavily on the interdependence, the kind of social kind of components of this. What is it about the ideas that are given that seem not satisfactory about the hypothesis, and why you kind of choose the wisdom?
So there are two components of the grandmother hypothesis. One is what is the mechanism driving it, and is it unique to our species? And so that's a physiological story, right? Essentially, and one is the social story, assuming it is selected for us to no longer have babies for a full third of our adult lives, or the potential to live that you know um, is it then beneficial to our offspring? Does it become genetically selected for because of the ways in which an unburdened grandmother figure could then usually not only not compete with her daughter for local resources and mates, right, in the ancient or
Hmm.
AP kind of history, depending where this arises.
Hmm.
My mom and I aren't dating the same people, last I checked, but but like in that deep biological sense, a long, long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also that given that our babies are so very, well, frankly, useless when
Hmm.
they come out
Hmm.
for a very long time, so needy. That's usually the word that's used in biology. Needy. We have to do a lot of heavy caretaking, keep them alive, and help them survive and thrive for a long period before they are more independent in our species, right? Does having grandma around help for that? Now, I have a lot of sympathy for, why we might think that these social perks would be beneficial. I have two kids, ages 3 and 5, and I would not be on book tour right now if someone else wasn't watching them. And one of the people watching them is indeed my mother in law, who is miraculous. Her name is Latika. She was born in Nairobi and she's currently in Seattle helping out with my grandkids, along with the father of said children.
Of
So it's great that we help each other out.
course.
You know what I mean?
Hmm.
would she be so freely available to if she had her own babies right now? I mean, true. Yeah, probably not.
Mm,
Probably not. Also, however, because she's in her 70s, that would probably hurt
mhm,
and be tiring. And many reasons
mm,
why it's great. So, the first thing that I found a little bit of an issue with was the mechanism side of that question, which is to say, did our ovaries evolve to specially shut down early?
mm,
Right? In other words, did they detach from our longevity plan? Like every species has a general longevity plan, like an average age at which males and females tend to kick the bucket,
mm,
right? And that you might be able to extend beyond an average age, but there's often a cap on that,
yeah.
where aging catches up to you, senescence looks the way it does, your teeth are falling out, and you die. Okay, fine, right? That's as true of mouse as it is of us,
Mhm,
mice and men. This is true.
mhm,
So, the interesting thing that I found, and this is partially Susan Albert's work in primatology, but there are others, and actually there's some embargoed things that I can't talk about right now. But
mm,
anyway, the general idea seems to be that primate ovaries senesce, that means they age, at a very similar rate across multiple species, right? If you control basically for lifespan, that there's this, they tend to peter out in such a way,
mm,
right? And so, in other words, the story of our menopause may not be the fact that our ovaries age and stop popping out eggs, which, of course, is how we then are fertile, right? And could have babies,
mhm,
right? Menopause kicks in again when you stop making eggs and stop having periods. That's that transition around age 50 for most people. Um, but rather that we massively extended the human lifespan to as much as an additional third of what we had been working with before. Now, we don't know exactly when that happened.
yeah.
There are some ways of knowing, usually with looking at how teeth shift from milk teeth to adult teeth and looking at layers of enamel, a little bit like tree rings.
Mm,
Actually, that's
mm,
part of how you can age some of our skeletal ancestors that we've dug up. So, we don't know exactly when that went down, but we do know that it happened. We also assume that for a very long time, it probably didn't happen very often, right? Because of the local jaguar, right? Remember that for a very long time, usually infection,
mm,
actually, but many of the things that would take us out took us out well before we would become, a 60 or 70-year-old person.
mhm,
Yeah. But nowadays, of course, we have lots of social support and we have probably physiological mechanisms that help the rest of our bodies keep going. And the idea is, well, maybe the ovaries just didn't get the message. Maybe they're just still running the old monkey plan, as it were, and the rest of us kind of just keep living on,
mm,
and by the rest of us, I mean literally our other organs,
mm,
right? And so that's a different way of thinking about how the grandmother hypothesis could even have kicked off, right?
mm,
That we would be selecting for longevity in general, with then the fact of no babies being a thing that's a result of selecting for longevity,
mm,
right? So then it's like, oh, okay, well, if that's the thing, then like, why were we selecting for longevity?
mm,
And in many, many different social species, older members of a group are the ones who hold knowledge that, by definition, the younger members don't have because they didn't encounter a rare crisis before. So that's how I think it's like four species of toothed whale have menopause, something like that.
that
But I
sounds
lean a
right.
lot on transient orcapods because one, we very recently discovered this. It's hard to study things that live in deep water.
Mhm,
So there's that. Finally got enough scientists on boats, cetacean experts, and we could track that down. But the thing is that these matriarchal,
mhm,
menopausal orca, killer whales, living again, like us, a full third of their adult lives without making babies, with presumably senescing, aging ovaries, along the way. Um, they aren't really responsible for a lot of extra childcare of the grandbabies. They do a lot of assistance with their sons, actually. Like every male member of this species is mama's boy. Like
mm,
stays with her for life. And when she dies, in fact, he dies much sooner than he would otherwise,
mm.
sadly. Even when he's a full ass grown giant killer whale, it's just that the social interdependence of that relationship greatly influences his health. Anyway, so she's not really like getting extra food for the grandbabies. She's not really like doing extra defense for the grand. Like that doesn't seem to be what the menopausal older females are doing. What they are known for doing is leading the pods to special food sources in times of crisis.
Mm,
Local food runs out, she leads the pod to where's a good place to go that not everyone knows about because they haven't gone there. She also seems to be particularly important in helping teach younger generations to do special hunting techniques, like this cool thing that some killer whales do where they line up all in a row like linebackers and bum rush an ice flow such that the bow wake of their massive bodies moving in the water rolls over the top of that ice flow and knocks off a poor seal who is trying to sunbathe there. It's very sad for the seal and very good for the orca. So they're, which is to say, what they're valuable for in that social species is their wisdom.
mm.
They're valuable for what they know, what they can offer their social group from that wealth of leadership and knowledge, which, of course, is something you want to tell any older human being. Like the reason you're valuable is because you know stuff. So it's a nice story. It's just useful, I think, in that that may also well have been true in our obviously very deeply interdependent, very social species over deep time where as we moved especially into multiple different uh, ecological environments, right? Multiple different places in the world, we were known for our adaptability, but part of how we adapted, of course, was by having these complex social worlds, which were probably better strengthened by having some old members who knew what to do in times of rare crisis.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I found myself, I haven't really heard this, so I had more and more questions about it, and I like the way you laid it out, and I think it is interesting to see what we could learn from other, social mammals that are doing this and saying, okay, what could that mean maybe for us, or
Right.
in many ways, it does seem more because of just we're living longer that it's a more of a newer occurrence of sorts, and so that's
Yes.
it's an interesting thing. You end the book, you talk, there's the last chapter which I wish we could get into, but talk about love, which is obviously a very interesting uh it's an interesting thing, an idea that we all feel and know, and it's very difficult. But you also towards the end you talk about, I believe you ended right towards the last couple pages about, you say that we've evolved to be sexist, but that we don't have to be, and that women have given all the power to that men have over women, and that we can hopefully reverse that as we move forward in the 21st century. So just what is the final thing you want to say on that bit, or about the book generally, of what you're trying to say here?
So I wrote quite a lot of the conclusion for the book during the Obama era because I didn't write everything in order. And then, of course, I went back and revised. And, it was a piecemeal process of looping through the book and its structure as I moved forward in my research. But of course, as Trump came into his presidency, and then Biden after him, I have had to repeatedly kind of sit with my feelings, as it were, as many people have for various reasons.
Hmm.
And I had to, because my book ends on a hopeful note, as you say,
Hmm.
because I do believe we are moving inexorably towards a more sex egalitarian future, or gender egalitarian,
Hmm.
a future that embraces diversity of bodies and culture, and most certainly between this most obvious uh, diversion of body type, which is male and female. Now, I do it in a number of ways, as you've seen yourself reading in that chapter. But fundamentally, I had to decide if I still felt that way when it came publication time.
Mm,
I had to I had to decide if I wanted to change my ending. You
mm,
know what I mean?
mm,
Because needless to say, there have been some really painful losses
mm,
when it comes to the rights of women and girls
mhm,
in this country and elsewhere. Things which, no matter where you are in a political spectrum, also obviously impact the health of women and girls
mm,
everywhere. There's been a massive downgrade in public support for gynecology of all types across the board, not simply in birth control, but also obviously,
mhm,
and how we might educate girls. And there's just been there's been a lot of a feeling of loss among the she folk, let's say, and and it's hard. It's hard to decide if there's reason for us to still feel hopeful.
mm,
And the odd privilege that I've had over the last decade is that I've been thinking a lot about deep time,
mm.
which means that I am in a unique position to be able to pull the camera back and say, what is the deep trend?
Mm.
If you look historically, even in known history over the last few hundred years, it is very astonishingly clear that we have been moving forward and forward and forward to more sex egalitarianism in many different human cultures, not only in the West, actually. It becomes very, very clear if you look at the evolution of our physiology from early hominins forward, that there are, as I say in the book, many physical traits that seem to indicate a reduction of male competition, right? Which wherein males are no longer quite so much bigger than females. We talk about human men being bigger than human women. Again, I'm referring to cis men and cis women here,
Mhm.
right? The averages. We're talking about the hump of the curve here, not the outlier, right?
Yeah.
So we talk about that, but actually, you guys are not that much bigger than us.
Mm.
Like a male chimp is way bigger than a female chimp
Yeah.
comparatively.
Mhm.
And oh my God, gorillas are massive
Yeah, huge.
compared to female gorillas. The male is huge,
Yeah.
right? And so those are all different models that other apes have for what a lot of male-male competition might look like, what different mating strategies might
Mm.
be. And over the hominin line, you can see in the fossils that the male and female are getting a little bit more equal sized. Those big fangs that most male primates have, those show teeth
Mm.
that they flash at one another, usually to avoid fighting, actually. If you look dangerous enough, then you don't have to get hurt because he runs away. So that's why it's called a show trait. I show this to you, then we don't have to fight, right?
Mm.
That likewise shrinks back into the mouth, and now all you get is like the occasional Tom Cruise, right? Just like not a lot of show teeth going on, right?
Right, right.
And likewise, you get, well, we won't get into it now, but there's quite a lot to be seen in male genitalia and how it doesn't exactly align with a lot of male-male competition like you see in the chimps. Which is to say, the story of our past is written on our bodies,
Mm.
and our bodies don't tell a story of a lot of male-male competition. Our bodies seem to be telling the story of becoming more sex egalitarianism over the course of hominin evolution and into humanity now.
Mm.
So that isn't to say that people aren't suffering.
Sure.
That isn't to say that sexism isn't wildly detrimental as it exists today. It absolutely is. But I remain hopeful because I'm able to pull the camera back and know that we seem to very much still be on the right track. It's just largely our goal to reduce as much suffering as we can along the way, right? But losing hope is, well, it's you would have to ignore our history to lose hope.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I like that framing, that very long kind of, wide lens of looking at how we go throughout millions of years and thousands of years and seeing like, yeah, there is a lot to be hopeful for. There's a lot of tough stuff for sure. There's been good progress. There's still lots of progress to be had, but I think that there is still room for hope. And so I think your book is super important, super essential for people to read and to be educated on and to really get that perspective. The book is called Eve: How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, and it's fantastic. It's one of the best books I've read this year. I'll be very honest with you. I really enjoyed it. I really did.
Oh, thank
I
you.
really, I,
That's so
I
nice.
really, really did. I really did enjoy it. Every now and then a book will kind of stick out for you, and this one definitely did. Any places that you want to point folks to, whether it's stuff online or any places that you're going to be at, or anything you want to point people to find you?
You're certainly welcome to look at my website. It's myname.com, so catbohannon.com. And I list my tour dates on there.
Mm.
That's one place you can look if you want to come see me say the things live on stage.
There you go. Well, and I hope people go out and buy your book. Kat, this was so much fun. I appreciate you giving me your time and your wisdom and your energy. I'm so thankful that we were able to have a conversation. I really did enjoy it.
This was great, Xavier. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to stop my recording.